The Kabbalah shows us something interesting. The intellectual side has 3 components, as does the emotional and movement triad. 3 descending triads of 3 components, incorporating 9 Sephiroth. But the sphere of Malkuth, which represents the corporeal body, is not divided into 3. There is a reason for this. The Kabbalah, amongst other things, is a schematic tool for self-knowledge and psychospiritual development. It identifies the 3 domains or minds which need to be understood and mastered on the road to psychospiritual development. The 4th domain, that is, the instinctive body and the intelligence which governs it, already functions at an optimal level. It does not need to fall under conscious control. For this reason, there are 3 traditional ways or domains for psychospiritual work, according to Gurdjieff. The way of the faker, in which mastery of the physical body through arresting movement brings genuine control and will. We find elements of this practice in other approaches in the form of certain dances, meditation, specific exercises which arrest movement, the 101 prostrations of the early Christian church, and things like that. And then, as described in earlier videos, the way of the monk, which cultivates emotional focus, control and will, and the way of the yogi, referring particularly to dharana, the 6th of 8 limbs of yoga, which cultivates mental control and will. This is not to say that the divisions of the instinctive centre cannot be brought under conscious control, at least to a certain extent. There are plenty of well-documented cases of yogis, monastics and others who have demonstrated the ability to control heart rate, breathing, thermal regulation and other instinctive functions ordinarily controlled by the instinctive centre. But for the purposes of psychospiritual development, this is not necessary. So 9-part esoteric religious and heterodox systems, such as certain forms of numerology, the Enneagram, the Kabbalah, and certain divisions made by Gurdjieff, take the moving and instinctive centres together, or as one physical component, just as the Tetragrammaton does. When we consider psychological type, however, or functions or divisions of centres, we're obliged to consider 4 discrete aspects, 4 triads. Now let us return to where we left off in the last video. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the middle of its street, and on either side of the river, was the tree of life, which bore 12 fruits, each month having a different fruit. We would do well to understand that the theme of division of 12 is found everywhere in the New and Old Testaments. In Gnostic literature, in Eastern religious philosophical literature, and this is no accident, but we will consider several of the more prominent examples and contextualize all this a little later. To be clear, this elaboration is unnecessary for the purposes of the Kabbalistic tree of life, but nevertheless, from this point of view, the Kabbalah is schematically identical to the zodiac of astrology, which includes 3 core divisions of the minds governing the intellect, emotions, movement, and the instinctive body, allegorically referred to as air, water, fire, and earth. I need to emphasize, as we explore the zodiac schematic, that for the time being, we need to completely leave aside the ideology of astrology as it exists today. Not just because no significant correlation has ever been shown between the traits proposed by an enormous body of astrological literature and those born under any of the 12 signs of the zodiac described, or that we never encounter astrologers who can accurately determine the zodiac sign of a person, even after observing them for some time, or accurately describe a person's personality with the help of a natal chart, which is awkward for the proponents of astrology. We may well conclude that it is neither predictive and that the evidence does not support it, so it can properly be regarded as a pseudoscience, at least in regard to how it exists today. But perhaps astrology existed differently in remote antiquity, and like so many other things, once it entered the public forum and over time, this knowledge became so distorted and decorated with inventions and imaginary things that whatever truth it may have contained once upon a time is now entirely unrecognisable. This idea is well worth exploring, but in order to do that we need to put all the methods, means and ideology of modern astrology to one side and approach it from an entirely different point of view. We observed in previous videos that there has been significant historical confusion about the placing and allocations of the quadrants of the zodiac and their apostolic and four creatures inspired motifs. And we decided from several points of view that they must be placed like this. I promised back then that as we went along I would provide even more evidence for this placement. Having built up a reasonable amount of preliminary knowledge, we might notice, when using our new tool of discernment, the Tetragrammaton, that the flow we find in the quadrants continues seamlessly into the astrological houses according to the Tetragrammaton continuum. He yod, he vow, he yod, he vow, he yod, he vow, and so on. Things get more interesting again when we consider the less well-known Deccans of astrology. The Deccans, or Deccanettes, are a famous component of the zodiac of Dendera, probably the most spectacular and noteworthy zodiac in the world, which was built by the ancient Egyptians in the 2nd century BC. Since then, it has largely been agreed upon that the Deccans represent further divisions of the zodiac schematic, but to date, no one has offered a convincing explanation as to how these should be arranged within the zodiac schematic. Much like the Kabbalah, we find representations like these when we search through the web. And we can be quite sure that most of these arrangements are the products of guesswork more than anything else. If the zodiac schematic follows the precise order of the Tetragrammaton through the quadrants and seamlessly through the 12 houses, then we might expect that the same would be true for the Deccans. And we do in fact find a schematic like this. One of the two predominant arrangements that exists today is one by the obscure and highly regarded Roman Marcus Manilius, rendered in the 1st century AD. According to Wikipedia, his work is one of great learning. He had studied this subject in the best writers and generally represents the most advanced views of the ancients on astronomy, or rather, astrology. A very low bar has been set for authoritative literature on the subject of astrology, particularly in terms of ancient knowledge on the subject, but this is probably the best we have. Manilius never mentioned the Tetragrammaton in his famous work Astronomica, and no one since, to the best of my knowledge, has understood that these divisions are not arbitrary. The Tetragrammaton flow precisely defines the quadrants, houses, and decans of the zodiac schematic used by astrology. I previously mentioned that there were two possible philosophical and esoteric religiously consistent placements of the quadrants, and we can see by all this that the other orientation is discordant with the Tetragrammaton flow. We might also notice that the lower half of the zodiac contains 4 houses which symbolically represent the material plane, the body, or creation, as mentioned in section 1. But only 2 symbolizing the psycho-emotional side, or God. And the reverse is also true. So the 12-part zodiac schematic is entirely consistent with what we learned about the most fundamental divisions earlier. The same corroborating distribution is found with the Deccans in the schematic. If I can digress for a few moments, some very interesting things happen when we insert other symbols into the 12-part and the 36-part zodiac schematic. The zodiac schematic repeats and amplifies the ideas which inform the Magen David or Star of David, as well as the observation from the emerald tablets, that which is above is like that which is below. the descent of the divine into the world of matter, and the potential ascent. Next, we might look at a few interesting orientations of the Enneagram symbol within the zodiac schematic. The two symbols very much seem to inform each other. This particular orientation is very interesting. It is a diagrammatic representation of some of Gurdjieff's key ideas. In this diagram, the fixed physical triad in red consists of three fused characteristics which define the core functional physical nature of the individual and, in fact, all corporeal life. The function of movement, the sex or reproductive function, and the corporeal body. This is a permanently fused, fixed, immutable triad and a material representation of the triadic Godhead. That is, it helps us understand what is meant by the fixed, fused, immutable, and mutually dependent nature of the religious triad. In both cases, all three are indispensable, all three must exist together and simultaneously, all three define the one, all compose the one. In the rest of this diagram, we notice that the intellectual parts of the zodiac schematic are synchronized with the intellectual parts of the Enneagram by ideologically associative color and number, as are the emotional parts. But neither of these are fused into a permanent, immutable triad. The idea of psychospiritual development, then, is that through work on these bodies in particular, we can create in ourselves, as it were, three immutable fixed triads. There is something else interesting in this schematic. Forgive me for using the astrological nomenclature of the zodiac of astrology, because it implies that we are talking about modern astrology, and this is not what we're doing. You will notice that in the so-called house of Pisces, the Pisces Deccan is also present. This happens only 4 times in this schematic. Pisces is in Pisces. Butting right up against it, Aries is in Aries. On the other side, Virgo is in Virgo, butting up against Libra in Libra. Nowhere else does this arrangement occur in this schematic, and it precisely marks the spring and autumn equinox. In a philosophically consistent manner, if we turn our attention to the top and bottom of this schematic, we notice that the houses Capricorn and Sagittarius oppose the Capricorn and Sagittarius decans we find between Cancer and Gemini at the bottom, while the reverse is also the case. This occurs nowhere else in this schematic, and this line defines the solstices. Someone asked earlier to talk about other religiously significant symbols, and there is so much to explore here, but I need to stay on track, so I will offer this one before returning to the main topic. The pentagram is a religiously significant symbol, still prominent today. Amongst many other things, it symbolically represents the Torah, that is, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which are said to have been written by the 72 elders of the tribes of Israel. We have covered quite a lot in this video already as we explore the raw ideas and philosophical schematics of the symbol used by astrology, but few people realize that all the zodiac divisions we are discussing here are intensely religious in origin. They do not belong to modern astrology. I will leave you with one further set of divisions before we move on to the next video, and we will include some religious examples of all these arrangements to underline the point. This is another wonderful diagram by our much admired Kerscher. It is known as the sunflower zodiac, or the zodiac of the Kabbalists. In Jewish mysticism, God is regarded as having 72 names or aspects, which is often referred to as the Shem HaMephorash. We might recall in the Old Testament book of Exodus that the 12 tribes of Israel were asked to align themselves according to the 4 points of the compass and arrange themselves around it. Each tribe included 6 elders. These 72 elders were designated to approach the Mount of Sinai in pairs to receive the 10 Commandments from Moses, although 2 were sick and did not make the journey. The zodiac template in front of us is an exact representation of all these allegorical descriptions. Now let's consider the ministry of Jesus. We all know about the 4 gospel writers and the 12 apostles, but few people are aware of the biblical references to 72 disciples, which, by the way, we also find in Islam and Confucianism. From Luke 10, after this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place he was about to visit. And he told them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few." The schematic in front of us, containing all the features of the zodiac, 2 of which are well known, 1 partially known, and 1 virtually unknown, are repeated in the Old and New Testament in precisely the same manner. Finally, in Gnostic literature, we find the book of Judas. For context, this dialogue took place shortly before the arrest of Jesus. Judas and Jesus knew what he must do, and that Judas would be damned for doing so. As though to compensate, Jesus took him to one side and explained to him certain secrets. The whole book, if you can find it, makes interesting reading, but I would like to draw your attention to this part. Adamas and the luminaries. Adamas was in the first luminous cloud that no angel has ever seen amongst all those called God. He, that the image and after the likeness of this angel. He made the incorruptible generation of Seth appear, the 12, the 24. He made 72 luminaries appear in the incorruptible generation in accordance with the will of the Spirit. The 72 luminaries themselves made 360 luminaries appear in the incorruptible generation in accordance with the will of the Spirit, that their number should be 5 of each. The 12 eons of the 12 luminaries constitute their father, with 6 heavens for each eon, so that there are 72 heavens for the 72 luminaries, and for each of them 5 firmaments, for a total of 360 firmaments. They were given authority and a great host of angels without number, for glory and adoration, and after that also virgin spirits for glory and adoration of all the eons, and the heavens and their firmaments. Thanks for listening.